All right, I feel honored to be introduced by Heather. Thank you. Yeah, Ben and I and Brandon will talk to you about modern kill chains, real world SaaS attacks that we see on the data set at App Omni, and then some mitigation strategies. So kind of at a meta level, we'll go through the talk here. We're going to start to reflect on where we currently are and how we got here, right? Because I feel like it's really important to provide some context as to where we are. I mean, we've only been doing this sort of internet security thing for about 30 years, and it's changed a lot in that time period. We'll think about why we're here. And then Ben's going to go through and just examine some real world attacks, like what it's like to be here, right? And then we'll think about how to get to a better place. Maybe we're in a good place. I don't know. We'll see. So I'm going to do, at the risk of being a little basic, sort of a 5-minute internet security history, right? Going back to when we first started with the internet, 1990-ish, you had the Morris worm like before that, but about 1% of the folks are on the internet. At this point in time, we're really at like a firewall AV model is the most basic thing. At the end, sort of folks start thinking of perimeters a little bit. Pretty mellow time. You saw some bad bugs at the end of it, like Internet Explorer and things of that nature. And sort of folks realize a little bit that they have to patch in addition to firewalls and the AV. So then you get to what I would like to call the worm era, I guess. It's just like crazy worming of everything. And if any of you guys are like old enough like me to live through this stuff, sorry if you get PTSD. It's, Configure, SQL Slammer, all of this stuff. We start hardening up and talking about like a perimeter. We can't just have a firewall. We've got to have like perimeter stuff, and it's a stack of security tools on the perimeter, right? Start to get into the Microsoft trustworthy computing notes, and then right at the end of this epoch, you start to see the beginning of like targeted breaches, right? And this is like actors at keyboard working. You see Russia and Estonia go at it with a bit of cyber war. And then Aurora, right? It really wakes people up at this point in time that these operators are gonna come this way, and it's gonna get worse going forward. So then you get to a stage of like 2008, 2010 range where you start to get sort of the introduction of infrastructure as a service with AWS, right? The Google folks like come up with Beyond Corp in sort of the mid-range of this epoch, which is a great model, and then YubiKeys as well, probably in a response to the Aurora stuff. And so here you see IaaS, it isn't a huge problem because it's actually kind of nice that some of these organizations have to take stuff that's in their DMZs internal or maybe just on their corporate networks, move that out and actually put it somewhere that's safe and access is controlled to. So not too bad there. Then we start to get into an epoch of SaaS adoption, right? At the beginning of this epoch, you have organizations are saying we use about 16 different SaaS products, right? Like no big deal, really, logging into them directly, generally. And then like 2017, Okta goes public, has like a bunch of 3,000 or so customers, and you really get people putting their IDP on the internet. This changes the attack surface a lot. You, at this point, see ransomware, just the beginnings of it start to come, and like this is a great idea to make money off of hacks, right? And then you get into, I guess I just called it the IaaS, PaaS, SaaS +++, right? Now we're at a point where organizations are saying we use 160 SaaS apps, we put our IDP on the internet, we shifted most of the business processes out to the SaaS apps, and we use like all PaaS and IaaS. We don't keep that stuff in house anymore. So like drastically over, I mean, you could say 30 years, but probably more like 20, we changed our attack surface a lot. We added a lot, and like we weren't crushing it before, honestly, and we're struggling a bit now. So super simple. What a pre-cloud SaaS attack surface looks like. And some of you remember this. It was dead easy, honestly. We put a perimeter around stuff. We put some nice things hanging off the perimeter to do IDS, IPS monitoring, sending it back to SIM. Everyone came into the office. We could see their traffic, east, west, north, south. We had DMZs, so we were doing defense in depth. It was working. I mean, I did a lot of red team work, and everyone was on this model during this time period. Modern attack surface. Here's what it looks like, right? Got our IDP out on the internet, may or may not be connected back to the corp network. If you're working for a larger company, you probably still have to support this corp network in addition to all of this other stuff. You got a bunch of SaaS that's out there that's maybe behind the IDP, and then a bunch of SaaS that's maybe not behind the IDP. And then COVID came along and like sent everyone remote, and half those people came back, right? Maybe a bit more. And so there's SaaS that you're not even seeing any traffic on because these guys are not going through IDPs, right? I mean, maybe there's some severe SSO tax or something like that that they're charging, or you don't even know they exist because some business unit set it up and didn't ask security, which happens a lot. So let's just like distill observations about the attack surface, right? Legacy, we had perimeters. Those are gone. Those are dissolving. Sorry, if you think CASBs are still going to work, but they're not. VPN access, right? We still have that, but there's a lot of BYOD and working remote. Physical access controls, those were nice. Does anyone remember like NAC and Wi-Fi security and stuff when people would come in and have those things? So we can make sure that these are corporate laptops connecting to our stuff. That's gone. Uncontrolled upstream, people work at like Starbucks and wherever, right? Endpoint protection, I would say this has gotten a little better. I mean, we don't just look for SHA-256 hashes anymore. We have good logs coming from this stuff, and it's probably one good area. External IDP, like I said, put the IDP directly on the internet with Okta or Ping or whoever you use. And then we've moved all these business processes to external SaaS and infrastructure as a service. Infrastructure as a service, probably security a little better there than if you hosted it yourself. Okay, so like I said, I did a lot of red teaming in like 15 years. It was always the same, rinse and repeat on these castle and moat models. It was go scan perimeters, look for vulnerabilities, look for RCE. Probably not going to find it if they're at all decent about security. Find a bunch of people on LinkedIn, we're going to fish them, we're going to get shell, and then we're going to move laterally, internally, probably do some privilege escalation, and you'd have to iterate probably 3 to 5 times depending upon how hard the target was. And this was always the most nerve-wracking, right? You're in an op, you're running an op, you're inside the network, and if those shells get burned at that time, it's a real bummer because that's probably you've got a month of time in at that point, right? But rinse and repeat. This is what the kill chain looked like then. Still looks like this to some extent for some organizations now who haven't really adopted this cloud model. Modern kill chain. Here's what we see all the time, right? I'll still scan the perimeter, but probably not, right? I mean, I'm really just going to go after users right from the beginning. Go on LinkedIn. Everyone puts everything on LinkedIn now. You figure out their email format, start targeting these folks, right? I'm going to look on any sort of any sort of dump site for stealer creds that are for sale, and then maybe I'll SIM swap them. Probably not going to put that much effort into it. And then effectively just logging into the IDP, right? Once you're in the IDP, I'm not sure how many people have noticed this, but a lot of pretty tiles appear where things that you can click on and go into. And the access control is generally not least permission model, right? So you get in there, move around, do some recon internally on these things. And there really isn't a need for persistence or command and control. Some people do some privilege escalation with OAuth and some API tokens and things of that nature. But really it's pop into the IDP, see what services are there, move around into those, get information from Slack or Teams or wherever to see what's going on, go into doc repos, steal stuff from doc repos, and then steal stuff from source code repos. And then if you really want to ball out ransomware-wise, you use that, leverage that up to move into their infrastructure as a service, lock it all up, send the ransom note, right? This is what we see. This is a very short kill chain compared to the one that I previously described. And so my daughter the other day was she's 4, she was like, why does your hair look like tinfoil? The color of tinfoil. And I'm like, this is why, right? I worry about this stuff, right? We've sort of substantially expanded our attack surface. A lot of it is on other people's stacks. I mean, we're saying walking in, a lot of these vendors have the same problem that we have, right? So we've substantially reduced the effective controls by moving this stuff out. And as a byproduct, we've shortened the kill chains, right? The internet is still always how the internet's begun. It's lawless. There's not a lot of ramifications for your actions, to be honest. And so this is exactly what you would expect would happen, right? I mean, you see the kids from the comm and Scattered Spider, they're all winning, right? And these are not incredibly skilled groups, but they're good at SIM swapping and they're good at social engineering, so it's working. You see them then signing up as ransomware affiliates, and you see ransomware as a service platforms offering this stuff, doing the same sort of thing. Credential spraying actors are still winning. It blows my mind that the Russian actors that did the Midnight Blizzard job, the initial access is credential spraying. What year is this? This is 2024, people. This should not work anymore. Info stealers, Raccoon, Redline, all with a resurgence. And then you still have, APTs working and hacking the supply chain and all these sophisticated actors that you don't see with zero-click ODay for iOS, right? And we're all losing as a byproduct. And so I'm going to hand it over to Ben now. He's going to take you through some specific attack data that we see on the platform, and then I'll come back at the end, give you some mitigation strategies.
All right, thanks, Corey. So just quickly going over the data that we collected for this, we ingest about 1.2 billion events per day. That's across 24 distinct SaaS services. The types of customers that we provide protection for are in financial, legal, healthcare, pretty much all the interesting areas where threat actors are going to be interested in stealing data. For this data set that we analyzed, we had 1.9 million alerts over the last 180 days. And after doing some massaging of that data, cleansing things, et cetera, we were left with about 300,000 unique IPs that we then performed different types of enrichment using different intel sources. So what's that data look like? So just breaking down overall across MITRE attack tactics, as Corey mentioned once before, but I'll say it again, SaaS attacks don't really require most kill chain activities. As you can see here, most of the alerts that we have are about 70% around initial and credential access activities. We get about 28% of things that we can combine into what you might call like action on objectives, things like collection, exfil, impact type tactics. And that really is the majority of the types of spaces where we do get monitoring in SaaS. There are other types of foothold activities, lateral movement, privilege escalation, et cetera. But the reality is, as we mentioned before, in most of these SaaS applications, you get in, you have access to the data, you're golden. So from an attacker standpoint, these are great targets. Now, things you might not notice, or things you might notice in here is not being present. Recon activity, that makes a lot of sense. Typically, we see recon activities happening at things like firewall, DNS type activity. SaaS, we don't get that. Internal recon, similar thing. Most internal recon would be looking at types of read activities. In SaaS applications, you're almost not going to ever get those types of things. I think that makes a lot of sense. Google Drive couldn't afford to log an event every time someone reads some Google Doc, et cetera. So we're really left with this very condensed kill chain and these very specific areas for monitoring. So let's take a look real quick at the overall enrichment data that we have. Cool. So this chart here is showing a count of alerts grouped by our Intel tags and then broken down by the top 10 ASNs that we observe these types of alerts coming from. If you can't read this, I know these are always a little challenging to read. More than half the Intel tagged alerts are labeled as suspicious IP and scanner addresses, and they're originating from 3 cloud providers, but we see many of the other ones as well. Just pointing out here, Cloudflare, Amazon, and DigitalOcean. Personal favorite of mine for setting up any type of infrastructure for shady things. Additionally, one thing to call out here is we did have a small cluster of alerts from this Intel enriched data from a German privacy group called the Renewable Freedom Foundation. And while these were all tagged as Intel sources, or sorry, open proxies, Tor nodes, and VPNs. And while the mission of this group and many groups like it are positive and we're fully supportive of those, they provide anonymization services for folks who may be working in high-risk areas, folks like journalists, et cetera. Unfortunately, these are also great things for attackers to use. So we're finding this to be quite a challenge in terms of monitoring and tracking different types of threat actor groups, primarily because, again, these services are open for many people to use. So moving on here, let's take a look at if we ignore our threat intel data and just move back and look at what are the top ASNs that we're seeing compared to the stages of tactics. And pretty much we're seeing the exact same thing, right? So credential access, initial access, it's where the majority of our data is. Again, cloud providers are some of the biggest ASNs responsible for these types of things. We're also continuing to see anonymization services existing, right? And so when looking at this slide and the previous one really interesting thing popped up for us. And that was the consistent presence of alerts originating from ASNs owned by China. And the reason this is interesting is primarily because this is all taken from US-based companies. And we know that there are challenges when it comes to data residency requirements. And so this was something that we decided to dive into a little bit more. Cool. So doing a bit of cleansing on that data and digging in, this was a set of a cluster of information that we found to be particularly interesting. So what we have here is essentially evidence of brute force logins using valid accounts. And these were actually flagged by Okta's security engine. So these are actually just pass-throughs that we consume on behalf of customers. And in this case, what we saw was pretty much after the fact that they were able to brute force their way in, they quickly moved into exfilling data. So we don't have alerts for any other stages in the kill chain. This is essentially access, pivot into M365, exfil data, attackers win. So I want to reiterate the point here today that this is a continual pattern that we're going to talk about. We see this over and over again, right? We're seeing a forced login of some sort, stolen credential, etc. Maybe we can observe some activities in the middle of foothold type activities, but really it's stealing data once you're in. So now let's step back real quick and talk about all of our data broken down across different techniques. There we go. Trying to manage 2 laptops. So what you're looking at here is we took all of our data, decided to put this inside Neo4j graph database. We wanted to explore potential relationships in that data and continue looking for interesting tidbits across all the different alerts that we collect. You're seeing here in green, these are all of our intel tags for all the IP addresses of alerts. And then in red, these are the techniques that are actually being, that we're observing. And so as you can see here, that's highlighted the valid account usage. We see it over and over again. Almost all of the Intel tagged alerts are related to valid account usage. So another way to put this is essentially we have attackers stealing credentials and logging in through the front door of these applications. There's really nothing crafty going on here. It's very straightforward attacks that we continue to see over and over again. And so the second piece that I wanted to call out, however I blew it and didn't actually blow it up enough, in the very bottom left, there is 5 red nodes connected to a single node. Those are all MFA and MFA interception related techniques. And so we'll dive into these a little bit more in the next few slides. Cool. All right, so continuing with our graph database view, what you're looking at here is all of that credential access activity blown up and added with our Intel enriched data. And so I think even without looking and understanding every single node up there, it's pretty obvious. Our Intel enriched data is telling us that threat actors are continuing to get access. These are known, very well known, tagged malicious and suspicious types of IPs. And yet they're still logging in the front door, they're still getting access, and they're able to achieve objectives with very little effort. So again, lots of suspicious IPs that we can see here. That's what everything in red is. Our green, again, is our Intel tag nodes. And I think it's also worth mentioning at this point that realistically, there is likely some noise in this data set. I think most people that have worked in threat detection understand that that's just a factor we deal with. The work from home craze has definitely made it a challenge for defenders. We gave people the ability to work from anywhere, but many companies forgot to give them the tools to do it securely. And so you have people trying to make a good choice, like searching for a VPN because they're logging into some, or using some Wi-Fi from coffee shop, etc. But if they don't have a company-approved VPN service, who knows what that service is that they're actually using? So this is a challenge now where we also have threat actors using these services to hide their activity. We have employees trying to do the right thing, but also potentially using some of these shady services, and essentially just creating a headache for anyone in threat detection. So let's continue from here and dive into 2 very specific techniques that we have observed and talk a little bit about the challenges that we continue to not meet. All right, so looking at this Sankey diagram, these are anonymized orgs, and we are showing signs of successful brute force and MFA exhaustion. So all in green, those are all brute force successful attempts in Salesforce. And then in red, we see a combination of successful brute force in Okta, as well as successful MFA exhaustion within Okta. And so what we're seeing in the Salesforce side, at least, is roughly like a 0.4% success rate. So to put that in perspective, attackers don't care about the success rate. I don't think anyone actually cares about the success rate, but the point is it's working. And so from an attacker standpoint, they're gonna keep doing it because it is successful. And it only is a matter of time before they get in. And as I mentioned before, once you get in, you have access to all the data in most cases. So it's going to continue to happen until we start putting the right types of controls in place to protect against this. And so shifting a little bit over to the Okta side of the house on the MFA exhaustion. This is a very small sliver of the class of MFA exhaustion that's successful that we're observing, because this is actually just using Okta Verify. So that's the mechanism in which you log in, and then Okta Verify will give a push notification to the employee's mobile device, and then they can approve or deny. So what an attacker is doing here is essentially they have stolen the credential already, they're initiating the MFA flow, and they will continue to push and push and push until an employee eventually gives in, gets exhausted from these types of things, gets annoyed, whatever, and hits approve, hoping that it goes away. But what they've really done is just created an MFA bypass for this attacker. And so again, even when we have the controls, they're not always being implemented in the right manner. And when we don't have things like phish-resistant MFA, these are the sorts of effects that we see, where we have a false sense of security in our program because we've implemented a control, but we haven't fully protected that control. So at this point, as I mentioned before, the attackers got in. What happens next? In most cases, they have access to everything. Generally, this is where I'd like to talk about some of the internal movement, internal recon, et cetera, but like we said, it just doesn't really occur a lot. So we'll use some specific examples later, but for now we're going to pivot over to actions on objectives. Cool. So this is really just a collapsing of impact, exfil, and collection tactics, and that actually more accurately represents the stage of attack in SaaS. As I said, you get in, you have access, it's over. And so looking at this data, you can see from our threat intel tags again, Office 365, M365, whatever you want to call it, is a fan favorite for stealing data, and then that's followed by Workday and Google Workspace. And I think that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because this is where businesses are putting their most critical information around the business. So cyber criminals are always going to be looking for these things, using it to steal data, perhaps, using it to find other ways to continue to pivot throughout the environment. So now, what I want to do is, we've talked about generalities of these different stages. Let's look at 3 specific sequences of attacks that we've seen, showing the whole kill chain in action. All right, so we did a lot of different types of analysis of this data. We actually did some basic statistical analysis and performed clustering. And we had a handful of these different kill chains that we wanted to show. These are 3 of the ones that we felt kind of really helped continue with the story and really show just overall what's happening across your SaaS landscape. It's also worth noting that in this analysis, we also did just some basic IP correlation. And it turns out that that was also very effective for finding these full-on kill chains. So what are we looking at here? Essentially, you have a threat actor logging into an IDP with a valid token, most likely stolen somewhere. They modified the allowable IP ranges for authenticating to other SaaS applications. They've deleted a bunch of settings. And then from there, they were essentially able to steal a bunch of data. So I think this one was 300 or 400 different files that we saw distinct that were stolen out of this environment. These were like cloud storage, like blob stores, et cetera, as well as like wikis, support pages, all the places where people are not supposed to be, but are absolutely storing more credentials for service accounts and other things. From there, the threat actor modified the authentication policy for other applications, logged into an HR management app, and then modified direct deposit election information, most likely in this case to direct funds into their accounts. And then finally, in this stage, threat actor was able to set up ongoing exfiltration by setting up email forwarding to an attacker-controlled address. And so I think the main point to look at here is this took about a month from initial alert of suspicious login all the way until full-on stealing of data, right? And that was about 30 days. So realistically, threat actors are getting in and moving fast. All right, so let's move on to the second one here. So this one, pretty similar pattern. We have stolen credential used, and then the attacker was able to search Slack for sensitive information. So this was the alert for anomalous search activity. From there, we believe that they were able to identify some credentials in there. That gave them a subsequent login that actually was flagged by Okta as high risk, but it appears that no action was performed on that account, and so it was left to continue operating as normal. From here, data exfil was successful again, along with mass resource deletion. This is a pattern that we've observed across a lot of different accounts. Downloading data, deleting data, right? And then towards the end of the observed activities, we saw a refresh token that was used to then log in and update banking account information again. So most likely redirecting funds to their own owned accounts. And so I think the main point to take away from this is that all of your SaaS really are important in the right context. And threat actors are getting crafty, and they are understanding that these are places where people are putting credentials, even though they most likely shouldn't be. So it's important to understand that monitoring of all of your SaaS is extremely important. Cool. And then the last chain I want to talk about here, similar pattern. All right, so here we have a password spraying attack that was actually successful. From there, we saw a mass downloading of data. We saw that they were able to set up email forwarding for ongoing exfiltration, delete resources again. In this case, we believe this was trying to just impair the overall incident response process. And then 13 days later, we saw this attacker try and come back, but they failed to log in because of a conditional access policy. However, we believe at that point, they started working on alternative methods to get into the account. And so we saw that they were able to steal different credentials, use those credentials to then add a highly privileged role and add credentials in Office 365 or Azure. And then from there, they were able to use Azure AD to start accessing resources not within AD itself. And so again, I think the most important thing that, most important thing that we really want to talk about here is that threat actors are using SaaS to pivot into production resources. And really, they're going to take anything and everything that they can along the way. And so SaaS is not only just its own isolated resource, right? SaaS can be a gateway to get into your production systems. All right. So as we've talked about this before, but just to kind of summarize things here, the reality is that system identity controls are severely lacking in many of these SaaS products. Ultimately, we don't have things like IP allow lists, or if we do, we can't utilize them because of remote workforce, or because we have some cloud resource that needs to log into that system to perform some task. Well, what about even just blocking basic Tor access? Everybody's very aware of Tor. Nobody, I think, should have a reason to be logging into employee systems with Tor, and yet that's not something that we can do today. Well, what about device level controls? Can we do things like corporate device checks to make sure that you're only accessing SaaS applications from your corporate-owned device? Doesn't exist in just about every SaaS application that we've ever looked at. What about device attribute profiling? So say, for instance, that somebody from HR logs in from San Francisco on Tuesday, and then 3 days later, they log in from, I don't know, the Balkan Peninsula, sure. Can we get a warning? Will a SaaS application tell you that your device attribute has changed significantly? We don't see it. It doesn't exist in many products today. And so even then looking at authentication flows, it's the same problems that we see. While you can get SSO in many SaaS applications today, you're going to pay for it, for one. And for two, in most cases, these SaaS applications don't allow you to actually then go and restrict alternative authentication methods. How many times have you seen somebody log in, for anyone in the monitoring space, from their personal account into some corporate-owned resources? It happens because the controls don't exist to block these types of things, or if they do, companies aren't implementing them. So last point I'll make here is just MFA, same problem. MFA is great, but as I showed in the slides before, ultimately, there are bypass techniques for MFA, and realistically, you can't even do this with service accounts because, again, they need to be able to get into these services as well. So all of this points to the fact that we have a controls problem and we have a monitoring problem that we need to continue to focus on improving. So just to quickly summarize overall TTPs, there we go. Essentially, on the credential access front, Data brokers are having a resurgence. Credential stealers, info stealers are having a resurgence because these are easy creds to steal, I guess, for some reason, and they are easy to get in and steal things. So we're buying, phishing, cred spray, cred stuffing. These are all the types of things that might seem basic, but these are being successful. These are happening today. On the persistence front, looking and monitoring for types of authentication process modification or use of or creation of alternative credentials, another great area to monitor for. And then lastly, on the impact stage, essentially just monitoring where is my data going, right? What's happening with the SaaS data that I have in these systems? Who's downloading it? Where is it going? When and why, right? All the questions we should be asking about our SaaS data. And then just to quickly touch on methods here, all the favorite ones are still in play: VPNs, proxies, cloud providers, Tor, you name it, it's all there. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it back off to Corey.
All right, thank you, Ben. That was great. So I'll talk about some strategic and tactical mitigations because, this is not a happy story. So we want to leave here with good vibes and stuff that we can do to fix this, right? Just to generally summarize, how did we get to the spot of this expanded attack surface and all these successful attacks using pretty basic techniques? We bought a bunch of PaaS and IaaS and SaaS, moved most of our business processes to that stuff. We moved our IDP out into the cloud, and a lot of companies were not ready for this, as you can tell by the fact that cred spraying and cred stuffing is working. COVID came along and totally accelerated the whole thing. Everyone went remote. Everyone bought whatever SaaS they needed to use to do their job. And it was cool because it was a pandemic, right? And people don't have a lot of experience with that. And then, I kind of think that we diluted zero trust down a lot as an industry to the point where we called everything zero trust and everyone was just forget it, I'm not buying that. But this is the effective model to deal with this going forward. So we have to do a good job. We have to have clear and concise methods of zero trust that we're using, and we have to implement them well. Because like I said before, perimeters are not coming back. I'm sorry. So at a high level, from a strategic perspective, this is the same thing we've always been doing, right? This is identify, protect, detect, and respond. But we got to do it on new attack surface. So you've got to know your SaaS and your IaaS and your PaaS in use. You got to know the users on it. You got to know the data on it. You got to classify it, because if you've got 150 SaaS apps, there's categories of ones that are important and there's some that aren't, right? And you got to know the interconnects between them. Now everything is, OAuth. Hey, can I get access to that? Every user, yes, 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 right? And before you know it, they're all woven together. Can be really problematic. Then you got to take, your important SaaS apps. You got to dive into them, look at the posture, set the configuration to the way that you want it to be, right? We've seen some attacks recently where there's a backdoor to log in, even though you have SSO. Probably don't want that, right? A lot of these, SaaS products they were minimum viable products when they were released. They move forward, they turn features on by default. A lot of features you probably don't want, right? So harden your tenant, keep the posture across the SaaS tenants that are important to you and the SaaS orgs that are important to you. And then detect, right? It blows my mind the amount of CISOs I talk to them, you get your SaaS logs and process them into your SIM and read them. They're like, no. I'm like, do you have a SaaS security problem? No, guess not. You wouldn't know if you did, right? So it's really important to take your SaaS products, put them into the same systems that you're using, do threat intel matches on them. Ben was showing, 20% of the alerts that fire are from known bad IPs across the data set that we have. Those should automatically, if that's post-auth, you want to know about that yesterday, right? So it's important to put this stuff into a SIM, into the same detection systems that you use for your on-prem stuff, enrich with threat intel, enrich with some of these other services like Spur and whatnot, and then have some sort of process to deal with new SaaS and new IaaS that comes along, because you can't just tell everyone you can't use this SaaS product, you can't use that SaaS product. You got to make risk-based decisions and assess them accordingly. And then lastly, I hope you all already have, a good response program, but you got to integrate into your XDR, MDR, any acronym that you want to call it, and then your IR process. So when things happen across SaaS, you saw Ben's sort of correlation across the different SaaS products. If you see 5 of those alerts firing together and they're from one of these flagged suspicious IPs, and these alerts are coming from a bunch of different SaaS products, you want to respond to that quite quickly and deal with it accordingly, right? Whether they're behind your IDP or not. So that's at a high level. it's basic. We'll get through this. We'll fix it. We'll fix the identity problem, but then we're gonna have to iterate again because like attackers have not even done anything interesting yet with this. They're only taking the lowest hanging fruit, right? Like if SIM swap is what has to be done, like some of these folks will SIM swap, right? And it will just keep ratcheting up. It's an arms race. It's always been an arms race. It's gonna keep being an arms race. So tactical stuff that you could do right away. Hopefully you're looking at this being like, I already did all that, so I'm gonna go have a drink after this. But you gotta use phishing resistant MFA devices. It is way too easy to social TOTP tokens out of people at this point in time. You just call them and say, you're the help desk and say, I just saw you log in. Can you read me the number on your device? And they're like, oh yeah, sure, sounds legit. Done. This is all Scattered Spider does. This is all the kids from the comm do, right? And then you got to move your important stuff behind an IDP that you can trust. This could be challenging in this day and age, but this is a place where you can enforce the use of this MFA hardware or these MFA devices that are hardware based, right? And just to say a little bit about passkeys, because people are like so hyped on passkeys. Passkeys are awesome when they're on your YubiKey, right? Passkeys are not awesome when they're stored in your iCloud account or your 1Password account, because where is the attacker going next if they know that's where those passkeys are? Right there. And they're going to do what it takes to get those accounts, right? And so once you got the hardware key stuff mastered, you can really move on to like device trust with hardware key. Like this is not only Corey logging in from San Francisco pressing his YubiKey, this is the corporate laptop we assigned him. And it shouldn't work if he uses his home laptop, right? I mean, it's basic. We were doing this ages ago with on-prem stuff, but we've lost it a bit now. It's easy for me to say avoid the use of service accounts, but like what we see all of the time, service account. Well, service account didn't support MFA, so we don't put MFA on it, and it gets shared. How does a service account get shared? Some people use like a password vault or whatever. Some people just put it in Slack. Some people just put it in G Drive, right? Where do attackers go? We demonstrated it right after they get access into Slack, into Teams, into G Drive. They look for these things. It's like you saw the anomalous search alert on Ben's log kill chain graph. That's someone searching for password in Slack, right? These folks know how to find stuff to let them move quickly through environments. And these service accounts are usually highly permed because no one wants to go back and keep granularly adjusting the perms. They're just like, just give it admin through so the thing works, right? We talked about ingesting your SaaS logs and monitoring them. I think the enrichment piece is really important because all of this stuff is coming from proxies and known VPNs. A little bit of Tor and some ASNs like from China where they just don't care, right? But most of this stuff you will see. If you get an alert that's firing and it's enriched with one of these proxies or VPNs, it's probably not good because your users probably don't use these things. And if they do use these things, you should probably tell them not to. And then if you can utilize some UEBA type capability at the SIM layer or in the product or wherever, you're in really good shape. This is the stuff that's just going to say, Corey logs in 98% of the time from San Francisco doing these things from a MacBook, and he uses Chrome, and all of a sudden he logged in from Estonia, and it's a Windows box with Firefox. Like, that looks weird, right? UEBA will pick that up right away and surface it. And then lastly, like, we got to do zero trust for real, and people got to stop calling everything zero trust. There's no perimeters. The only thing you're going to be able to deal with is identity and devices that you assign to folks, and those are the only things that you'll be able to root trust in and move on from there. So hopefully that's helpful to you. That's all we've got. If you want to chat about it, come find us after in the wrap room. Come by the booth. We're having a party later. Definitely come by that. And we really appreciate you guys coming.